This story created a sensation when it was first told. It appeared in the papers, and many big physicists and natural philosophers were, at least so they thought, able to explain the phenomenon. I shall narrate the event, and also tell the reader what explanation was given, and let him draw his own conclusions. This is what happened. A friend of mine, a clerk in the same office as myself, was an amateur photographer. Let us call him Jones. Jones had a half-plate Sanderson camera with a Ross lens and a Thornton Pickard behind-lens shutter, with pneumatic release. The plate in question was a Ratton's Ordinary, developed with Ilford Pyro Soda developer, prepared at home. All these particulars I give for the benefit of the more technical reader. Mr. Smith, another clerk in our office, invited Mr. Jones to take a likeness of his wife and sister-in-law. This sister-in-law was the wife of Mr. Smith's elder brother, who was also a government servant then on leave. The idea of the photograph was of the sister-in-law. Jones was a keen photographer himself. He had photographed everybody in the office, including the peons and sweepers, and had even supplied every sitter of his with copies of his handiwork. So he most willingly consented and anxiously awaited for the Sunday on which the photograph was to be taken. Early on Sunday morning, Jones went to the Smiths. The arrangement of light in the veranda was such that a photograph could only be taken after midday, and so he stayed there to breakfast. At about 1 p.m, all arrangements were complete, and the two ladies, Mrs. Smiths, were made to sit in 2 cane chairs, and after long and careful focusing and moving the camera about for an hour, Jones was satisfied at last, and an exposure was made. Jones was sure that the plate was all right, and so a second plate was not exposed, although in the usual course of things this should have been done. He wrapped up his things and went home, promising to develop the plate the same night and bring a copy of the photograph the next day to the office. The next day, which was a Monday, Jones came to the office very early, and I was the first person to meet him. "Well, Mr. Photographer," I asked, "what success?" "I got the picture all right," said Jones, unwrapping an unmounted picture and handing it over to me. "Most funny, don't you think so?" "No, I don't. I think it is all right. At any rate, I did not expect anything better from you," I said. "No," said Jones. "The funny thing is that only 2 ladies sat." "Quite right," I said. "The third stood in the middle." "There was no third lady at all there," said Jones. "Then you imagined she was there, and there we find her." "I tell you, there were only 2 ladies there when I exposed," insisted Jones. He was looking awfully worried. "Do you want me to believe that there were only 2 persons when the plate was exposed, and then 3 when it was developed?" I asked. "That is exactly what has happened," said Jones. "Then it must be the most wonderful developer you used, or was it that this was the second exposure given to the same plate?" "The developer is the one which I have been using for the last 3 years, and the plate, the one I charged on Saturday night out of a new box that I had purchased only in the afternoon that day." A number of other clerks had come up in the meantime, and were taking great interest in the picture and in Jones' assertion. It is only right that a description of the picture be given here for the benefit of the reader. I wish I could reproduce the original picture too, but that, for certain reasons, is impossible. When the plate was actually exposed, there were only 2 ladies, both of whom were sitting in cane chairs. When the plate was developed, it was found that there was in the picture a figure, that of a lady, standing in the middle. She wore a broad-edged dhoti. The reader should not forget that all the characters are Indians. Only the upper half of her body was visible, the lower being concealed from view by the low backs of the cane chairs. She was evidently behind the chairs and consequently slightly out of focus. Still, everything was quite clear. Even her long necklace was visible through the little opening in the dhoti near the right shoulder. She was resting her hands on the backs of the chairs, and the fingers were nearly totally out of focus, but a ring on the right ring finger was distinctly visible. She looked like a handsome young woman of 22, short and thin. One of the earrings was also clearly discernible, although the face itself was slightly out of focus. One thing, and probably the funniest thing, that we overlooked then, but observed afterwards, that immediately behind the 3 ladies was a barred window. The 2 ladies, who were one on each side, covered up the bars to a certain height from the bottom with their bodies, but the lady in the middle was partly transparent, because the bars of the window were very faintly distinguishable through her. This fact, however, as I have said already, we did not observe then. We only laughed at Jones and tried to assure him that he was either drunk or asleep. At this moment, Smith of our office walked in, removing the trouser clips from his legs. Smith took the unmounted photograph, looked at it for a minute, turned red and blue and green, and finally very pale. Of course, we asked him what the matter was, and this is what he said. "The third lady in the middle was my first wife, who has been dead these 8 years. Before her death, she asked me a number of times to have her photograph taken. She used to say that she had a presentiment that she might die early. I did not believe in her presentiment myself, but I did not object to the photograph. So one day I ordered a carriage and asked her to dress up. We intended to go to a good professional. She dressed up and the carriage was ready, but as we were going to start, news reached us that her mother was dangerously ill. So we went to see her mother instead. The mother was very ill, and I had to leave her there. Immediately afterwards, I was sent away on duty to another station, and so could not bring her back. It was in fact after full 3 months and a half that I returned, and then, though her mother was all right, my wife was not. Within 15 days of my return, she died of puerperal fever after childbirth, and the child died too. Thus it happened that her photograph was never taken. When she dressed up for the last time on the day that she left my home, she had the necklace and the earrings on, as you see her wearing them in the photograph. My present wife has them now, but she does not generally put them on." This was too big a pill for me to swallow, so I at once took French leave from my office, bagged the photograph, and rushed out on my bicycle. I went to Mr. Smith's house and looked Mrs. Smith up. Of course, she was much astonished to see a third lady in the picture, but could not guess who she was. This I had expected, as supposing Smith's story to be true. This lady had never seen her husband's first wife. The elder brother's wife, however, recognized the likeness at once, and she virtually repeated the story which Smith had told us in the morning. She even brought out the necklace and the earrings for my inspection and conviction. They were the same as those in the photograph. All the principal newspapers of that time got hold of the fact, and within a week there was any number of applications for the ghostly photograph. But Mr. Jones refused to supply copies of it to anybody for various reasons, the principal being that Smith would not allow it. I am, however, the fortunate possessor of a copy, which for obvious reasons I am not allowed to show anybody. One copy of the picture was sent to America, and another to England. I do not now remember exactly to whom. My own copy I showed to the Reverend Father Blank, M.A., D.Sc., B.D., etc., and asked him to find out a scientific explanation of the phenomenon. The following explanation was given by the gentleman. I am afraid I shall not be able to reproduce the learned father's exact words, but this is what he meant, or at least what I understood him to mean. The girl in question was dressed in this particular way on an occasion, say 10 years ago. Her image was cast on space, and the reflection was projected from one luminous body, one planet, on another till it made a circuit of millions and millions of miles in space, and then came back to Earth at the exact moment when your friend Mr. Jones was going to make the exposure. Take, for instance, the case of a man who is taking the photograph of a mirage. He is photographing place X from place Y, when X and Y are, say, 200 miles apart, and it may be that his camera is facing east, while place X is actually towards the west of place Y. At school, I had read a little of science and chemistry, and could make a dry analysis of a salt, but this was an item too abstruse for my limited comprehension. The fact, however, remains, and I believe it, that Smith's first wife did come back to this terrestrial globe of ours over 8 years after her death, to give a sitting for a photograph in a form which, though it did not affect the retina of our eye, did impress a sensitized plate. In a form that did not affect the retina of the eye, I say, because Jones must have been looking at his sitters at the time when he was pressing the bulb of the pneumatic release of his time and instantaneous shutter. The story is most wonderful, but this is exactly what happened. Smith says this is the first time he has ever seen or heard from his dead wife. It is popularly believed in India that a dead wife gives a lot of trouble if she ever revisits this earth, but this is, thank God, not the experience of my friend Mr. Smith. It is now over 7 years since the event mentioned above happened, and the dead girl has never appeared again. I would very much like to have a photograph of the two ladies taken once more, but I have never ventured to approach Smith with the proposal. In fact, I learnt photography myself with a view to take the photograph of the two ladies, but as I have said, I have never been able to speak to Smith about my intention, and probably never shall. The £10 that I spent on my cheap photographic outfit may be a waste, but I have learnt an art which, though rather costly for my limited means, is nevertheless worth learning, being closely allied to the art that can immortalize the art that baffles time's tyrannic claim.
The death of Vincent Purwitt, J.P. of Ellerton House, Ellerton, in the county of Buckingham, would, in the ordinary way, have received no more attention than the death of any other simple country gentleman. The circumstances of his death, however, though now long since forgotten, were sensational, and attracted some notice at the time. It was one of those cases which is easily forgotten within a year, except just in the locality where it occurred. The most sensational circumstances of the case never came before the public at all. I give them here simply and plainly. The psychical people may make what they like of them. Purwitt himself was a very ordinary country gentleman, a good fellow, but in no way brilliant. He was devoted to his wife, who was some 15 years younger than himself and remarkably beautiful. She was quite a good woman, but she had her faults. She was fond of admiration, and she was an abominable flirt. She misled men very cleverly, and was then sincerely angry with them for having been misled. Her husband never troubled his head about these flirtations, being assured quite rightly that she was a good woman. He was not jealous. She, on the other hand, was possessed of a jealousy amounting almost to insanity. This might have caused trouble if he had ever provided her with the slightest basis on which her jealousy could work, but he never did. With the exception of his wife, women bored him. I believe she did once or twice try to make a scene for some preposterous reason which was no reason at all, but nothing serious came of it, and there was never a real quarrel between them. On the death of his wife, after a prolonged illness, Purwitt wrote and asked me to come down to Ellerton for the funeral and to remain at least a few days with him. He would be quite alone, and I was his oldest friend. I hate attending funerals, but I was his oldest friend, and I was, moreover, a distant relation of his wife. I had no choice, and I went down. There were many visitors in the house for the funeral, which took place in the village churchyard, but they left immediately afterwards. The air of heavy gloom which had hung over the house seemed to lift a little. The servants are always very emotional, continued to break down at intervals, noticeably Purwitt's man Williams. But Purwitt himself was self-possessed. He spoke of his wife with great affection and regret, but still he could speak of her, and not unsteadily. At dinner he also spoke of one or two other subjects, of politics and of his duties as a magistrate, and of course he made the requisite fuss about his gratitude to me for coming down to Ellerton at that time. After dinner we sat in the library, a room well and expensively furnished, but without the least attempt at taste. There were a few oil paintings on the walls, a presentation portrait of himself, and a landscape or two, all more or less bad as far as I remember. He had eaten next to nothing at dinner, but he had drunk a good deal. The wine, however, did not seem to have the least effect upon him. I had got the conversation definitely off the subject of his wife when I made a blunder. I noticed an Erickson's extension standing on his writing table. I said, "I didn't know that telephones had penetrated into the villages yet." "Yes," he said, "I believe they are common enough now. I had that one fitted up during my wife's illness, to communicate with her bedroom on the floor above us on the other side of the house." At that moment, the bell of the telephone rang sharply. We both looked at each other. I said, with the stupid affectation of calmness one always puts on when one is a little bit frightened, "Probably a servant in that room wishes to speak to you." He got up, walked over to the machine, and swung the green cord towards me. The end of it was loose. "I had it disconnected this morning," he said. "Also, the door of that room is locked, and no one can possibly be in it." He had turned the color of gray blotting paper. So probably had I. The bell rang again, a prolonged rattling ring. "Are you going to answer it?" I said. "I am not," he answered firmly. "Then," I said, "I shall answer it myself. It is some stupid trick, a joke, not in the best of taste, for which you will probably have to sack one or other of your domestics." "My servants," he answered, "would not have done that. Besides, don't you see it is impossible? The instrument is disconnected." "The bell rang all the same. I shall try it." I picked up the receiver. "Are you there?" I called. The voice which answered me was unmistakably the rather high staccato voice of Mrs. Purwitt. "I want you," it said, "to tell my husband that he will be with me tomorrow." I still listened. Nothing more was said. I repeated, "Are you there?" And still there was no answer. I turned to Purwitt. "There is no one there," I said. "Possibly there is thunder in the air, affecting the bell in some mysterious way. There must be some simple explanation, and I'll find it all out tomorrow." He went to bed early that night. All the following day I was with him. We rode together, and I expected an accident every minute, but none happened. All the evening I expected him to turn suddenly faint and ill, but that also did not happen. When, at about 10 o'clock, he excused himself and said good night, I felt distinctly relieved. He went up to his room and rang for Williams. The rest is, of course, well known. The servant's reason had broken down, possibly the immediate cause being the death of Mrs. Purwitt. On entering his master's room, without the least hesitation, he raised a loaded revolver which he carried in his hand, and shot Purwitt through the heart. I believe the case is mentioned in some of the textbooks on homicidal mania.